Good morning, everyone. Happy Valentine's Day. I'm Andrea Kendall-Taylor, and I direct the Transatlantic Security Program here at the Center for a New American Security. I'm really happy to be co-moderating today's panel along with my colleague Emily Kilcrease, who's the director of our Energy Economics and Security Program at CNAS. This is clearly shaped up to be, for better or for worse, an incredibly timely discussion. As we all know, Russia continues to build its military forces on Ukraine's border, and there are no signs of de-escalation. We had a really sobering warning on Friday from our National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, who continues to warn about the imminence of a Russian invasion. Airlines are canceling flights to Ukraine. And so I think we're all in that period where we understand that we could see a major military incursion really any day now. And so to kind of talk about the sanctions packages that could shape up in that context, we're really delighted to have a really outstanding panel to talk through really a number of issues surrounding sanctions and their role and what we can expect should Russia escalate militarily in Ukraine. So I'm really happy to join three outstanding panelists. We've got Eddie Fishman with us today. Eddie Fishman is an adjunct fellow here at CNAS, and he formerly served as the lead State Department policy officer for Russia sanctions. Also joining us today is Tom Keating, and Tom is the founding director of the Center for Financial Crime and Security Studies at RUSI, which is a leading security and defense think tank based in the UK. And to round out our panel, we're really delighted also to have Dr. Maria Shagina, who is a visiting fellow in the U.S. Center for Politics and Power at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. So welcome, everyone. It's great to have you with us. Our time is short, so maybe we'll go ahead and jump right in. And Eddie, I want to start with you, maybe just to do a little bit of the lay the ground, set the table for us a little bit. Obviously, sanctions have been front and center of the administration's efforts to deter an escalation in Ukraine. But what is your sense of where those packages are now? And critically, can you talk to us a little bit about what that coordination has looked like with allies?
Sure. Thanks, Andrea. And thanks for organizing this conversation. Definitely timely. In the last 2 months, really, we've seen an unprecedented level of coordination between the United States, the European Union, and other U.S. allies really on this sanctions package. And I think that's the thing that really differentiates the current crisis from our experience in 2014, is that this has been kind of a slow burning crisis for a long time. And so what that means is there's been a ton of time to prepare, not only diplomatically, but also internally. And that's critical when you're thinking about imposing really strong sanctions against large Russian companies or banks. You really want to try to understand what the second order and third order consequences might be. With a few months to prepare for this, the Biden administration has had every opportunity to really drill down what those consequences would be and put together a strong package. And you hear that in the public comments. You hear Jake Sullivan state pretty forcefully that not only is the U.S. prepared to impose unprecedented consequences on Russia if there's an invasion of Ukraine, but also the EU, the UK, and Canada. And that to me suggests that the United States has a high level of confidence that if there is an invasion, that there will be a multilateral sanctions package, not just one that the United States is doing by itself. I think the second thing that's pretty interesting is that the Biden administration has gone pretty far in terms of telegraphing the specific contents of the sanctions package. They've taken some criticism for not being completely specific and saying exactly what they would do. But I actually think there's some wisdom in keeping some level of ambiguity. And they've done quite a bit in terms of telegraphing the likely targets. For starters, it sounds like the marquee component of any sanctions package is going to be significantly enhanced sanctions against large Russian state-owned banks. You've heard the names of Sberbank, VTB, and Gazprom Bank, the three largest banks in Russia. All of whom could come under pretty significant U.S. And potentially even European and UK sanctions if there's an invasion. I can get into sort of later in the conversation what those specifics might look like, but they would be much stronger than any financial sanctions that have been put in place on Russia thus far. You've also heard telegraphed significant export controls on Russia. In the last few years, we've really seen a significant evolution in these tools with the foreign direct product tool rule that has been imposed on Huawei. And you could see a similar export control regime imposed on critical technology exports to Russia. And then the third piece that I think is important are these personal sanctions against oligarchs and Putin cronies, which have also been telegraphed pretty widely, initially by the UK, but then also by the United States as well. And of course, I'd be remiss not to mention Nord Stream 2. It's dominated the conversation on sanctions for a long time. I think, honestly, unfortunately, because I don't believe it's as significant as the media has made it out to be. But I do suspect that if Russia invades Ukraine, that Nord Stream 2 will never come online, and that it won't be sort of the United States coercing Germany, but it will be more of a graceful exit by the German government. So I think that's kind of where we stand. I think if Russia invades, I do believe there will be a very significant sanctions package that goes into effect within days, both in the United States, but also the European Union and the UK. And then on sort of a longer term profile, if you look at what does sanctions look like a few months after a Russian invasion of Ukraine, I suspect that they'll only get stronger. And I think one of the arguments I plan to make today is that if Russia does invade Ukraine, I think it's only a matter of time before we see really almost Iran-level sanctions on Russia. I think it'll take some months. I don't think the Biden administration is going to do that right away, but I do think that's kind of the course of events that will unfold if Putin makes this decision to invade in the coming days or weeks.
Great. Thanks, Eddie. That's super helpful. We've heard the administration's mantra, start high, stay high. So definitely a different approach, as you've suggested, than it was in 2014. But Tom, let me come to you because unlike in 2014, the UK now has its own autonomous sanctions program. And so I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the kind of the view from the UK and how the UK views its role in the current crisis, given its kind of own autonomous powers now. And then also, if you want to also comment on how you think coordination has gone with allies and whether or not you think, we'll see the kind of coordination that the administration seems to convey that they believe that they have going into this.
Yes, well, let me add my thanks for inviting me to contribute today. Look, I think the UK has really tried to bark as loud as it possibly can do on this issue in recent weeks. I think we can debate the effectiveness of that, but we did actually see last Thursday the amendment to the existing UK-Russia sanctions regime, which, to be fair to the UK government, I think does lay out a pretty strong set of tools that could be used should, to quote, Russia take further action to destabilize Ukraine. And so I think the UK is prepared, at least as relates to the law. So that law targets persons who are involved with the Russian state, benefit from the Russian state. It potentially targets sectors of strategic significance, so chemicals, construction, financial institutions, obviously important from a UK perspective. So I think the UK has definitely set its stall out. The law seems to match the rhetoric. And the question is, if the moment comes, how will that all be put into place? There is an important point in all of this, though, as I think everyone will be aware, is that for the longest time, politicians on both sides of the aisle in the UK have been calling for action to be taken against dirty Russian money in the UK. And I think the government has got itself, in my view, into a difficult position because it's had to kind of acknowledge this problem in order to say things like the oligarchs will have nowhere to hide should Russia invade Ukraine, which suggests that they know that the oligarchs are currently hiding in the UK. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. I think what will also be interesting is to see how the UK coordinates to the left and to the right, so with the US and with the EU. I mean, I think an interesting point that I've taken away from some of the comments made by Jake Sullivan is that I'm not sure we can expect all three blocks to act in the same way. And by that, I mean everyone to sanction the same individuals, the same organizations. Obviously, the legal authorities will vary from country to country. So the interesting bit, I think, on coordination is how will that all come together to create a mosaic that is as effective as possible. And I think when it comes to it, the UK will be much more alongside the US. They like to use the phrase shoulder to shoulder in British politics when it comes to being alongside the United States. So I think we can expect the UK to be as tough on sanctions as the US, and perhaps have less of the economic concerns and caution that one might expect to see coming out of the European Union, which of course I'm sure we will talk further about. So, I would say, as somebody who is typically fairly critical of the existing government, so far so good. The proof will be in the action should the moment come.
One quick follow-up, Tom. So one of the questions that has come up kind of repeatedly in the course of discussion on the unity and cohesion of sanctions is what happens, especially at kind of, President Biden used the unfortunate term in public, minor incursion. And of course, I think it was, just because he said it out loud, I think that was the unfortunate part, because it's something that we're all thinking about. If we do see Russia kind of do something that is a little, short of the very overt kind of invasion into Ukraine, where they stay more in the hybrid realm, do you think that cohesion on the sanctions front will be more difficult? Is that something that you're worried about?
So interestingly, Boris Johnson's phrase, but he turns it around, is he talks about, should one Russian toe cap cross the border? And for him, that is inexcusable, in contrast to the way in which I think the comments came from the president. If I'm honest, I think the UK government is looking for an opportunity to show leadership. So I would sort of expect the UK government to be forward-leaning in this situation. I don't think the UK government would accept, a minor incursion, and I accept that the president did, although that was corrected. But I do think that cohesion will be difficult. I mean, obviously, the EU has a very long process that it has to go through. And Eddie made the point about we've had lots of warning. We have had lots of warning, but still the EU will have to go through its process. So I would expect, rather than a simultaneous, 3 shots at the target from the 3 blocks, we will see more of a, US, UK, and then the EU following along. That obviously presents a risk, because it gives an opportunity for the EU consensus to perhaps fragment. But in terms of consensus between the US and the UK, I would fully expect that to be strong.
Great, thanks, Tom. Maria, coming to you, kind of Eddie Tom has just talked about where the UK is. Eddie laid out kind of the big sanctions on banks, sanctions on oligarchs, talking about export controls. Can you tell us a little bit your view of how that would actually affect the Russian economy? We know that Russian foreign reserves are higher now than at any point that they've been in history, that they do have the capacity potentially to buffer, at least in the near term, some of these sanctions. So kind of how do you see if it is a more significant package along the lines of what Eddie is talking about, how impactful do you think that would be on the Russian economy?
Thank you very much for the invitation on my side as well. I think it's important to come back to the point that Eddie was trying to make at the beginning, comparison with 2014, because it's important to see the differences and similarities. In 2014, it was about coercion, about compellence. This time is deterrence, and it might be good news for the West because traditionally it's easier to deter than to coerce Russia. This is the good part of the news, but the other things that EU might be ready to impose sectoral sanctions. If we remember, back then it was very reluctant. Germany in particular was very reluctant to bring on board so-called third-tier sanctions or sectoral sanctions. This time the readiness is there on the EU side, but as you asked, Andrea, Russia hasn't been sitting idly and waiting for the sanctions. It has also come prepared. And I would say it has been more prepared than maybe the EU should have been prepared. Russia has ample international reserves, more than 630 billion at the moment, low sovereign debt levels, meaning that any sanctions on the sovereign debt will have less impact than it might be portrayed in the media, has been also conducting quite conservative fiscal policy. So on the surface, of course, Fortress Russia strategy has been working. it doesn't mean that Russia is immune to sanctions. Here, it's important to understand what type of sanctions the West is willing to impose. And here, while I agree that there is more coordination that we saw in 2014, there are still discrepancies. We won't see full alignment, obviously, for historical, economic reasons. Europe will always be more reluctant to impose those draconian measures. And we know that Nord Stream 2, SWIFT, any energy-related sanctions, Nord Stream 2 as well, are not the first choice of options from some countries. So that means that Russia could potentially exploit those differences or the discrepancies in sanctions regime, as we saw also in 2014. The other factor here is time factor. The longer we talk about what package we're ready to impose, also the disunity sometimes that comes between the allies and within the EU, that some member states are lobbying for carve-outs from sectoral sanctions, from financial sanctions because of closer exposure of Italian or French banks to the Russian financial sector. I think that partly can erode this deterrence effect, because the lack of unity also is important here. The sanctions that are ready to be imposed could have important impact, a negative impact on the Russian economy. If we're talking about placing Russian banks on the SDN list, that would be enormous impact on the Russian economy. If we include Sberbank, the largest Russian bank on the SDN list, and if the bank is on this list, no one would to touch it. That will have negative impact overall. Sanctions on oligarchs is probably the option with less blowback for the West, might be attractive, but again, depends, as Tom said, on the enforcement of this option. Cutting of SWIFT, we can discuss in a bit. And one of the sanctions option that is not being discussed but could potentially hit at Russia's at its heart is curbing oil and gas. But we know the interdependence that Europe has with Russian gas market and oil that the US receives from Russia works as a shield for triggering this option.
Great. Thanks, Maria. I actually want a question for all of you. I mean, one thing that I think people are now starting to think ahead is kind of how this could potentially escalate from here. So if the United States does come out and implement a strong sanctions package going after, significant Russian banks and with the export controls, and if we go after oligarchs, I think we would be likely to see at least some sort of Russian retaliation. And they do have leverage points, obviously natural gas is one of them, but thinking about metals or other things, fertilizers and what that might mean for global food prices. How do this Eddie and others who have been practitioners, how do you think about kind of coming and implementing a very strong sanctions package, but trying to mitigate the risk that we start getting into kind of an economic spiral where we're each kind of, it ratchets up into something more confrontational? So maybe Eddie, to start with you, but I also want to hear both from you, Tom and Maria, about how you think Russia would be likely to respond.
Sure. So there are basically two ways that this could boomerang back at the United States or European economies. The first is in terms of blowback, and that's really actually the unintended consequences of sanctions themselves. For instance, if you remember back in 2018, when the Trump administration imposed full blocking sanctions against Rusal, it spiked global aluminum prices, and they actually pulled back those sanctions without Russia changing its behavior at all, which I think is one of the more unfortunate experiences we had with Russia sanctions. The other, Andrea, as you said, is retaliation. That's what Russia could do to sort of either impose counter sanctions. If you remember in 2014, they banned imports of food products from the West in sort of a counter sanction mode, or honestly asymmetric retaliation, which we've talked about, cyber attacks against Western banks, which I think is probably the most concerning potential asymmetric retaliation. In terms of the first piece of what I was talking about in terms of blowback, I'm not all that concerned about blowback. And it may sound a bit cavalier, but we have had a lot of time to vet these sanctions options. And the way that U.S. sanctions law works is the Biden administration basically has unlimited authority to issue what are called general licenses, which are carve-outs in sanctions to enable certain transactions to continue to happen. So, for instance, I would suspect if Sberbank is imposed, put on the SDN list, there would be some carve-outs to, for instance, enable a wind down period. You wouldn't see a chaotic, exit necessarily from Sberbank. You may facilitate certain transactions to enable gas sales to continue to Europe. So I'm not worried about, banking sanctions affecting the ability to pay for Russian energy. I don't think that that's a real issue. I do think that certain Eastern and Central European economies are certainly exposed to blowback. As we saw in 2014, it's really the frontline states, the states that actually are most in favor of strong sanctions, like the Baltic states and Poland, that are actually most exposed to blowback from sanctions. Sberbank is present in 8 markets that are all in Central and Eastern Europe, right? So they have subsidiaries that are operating in places, like the Czechia and Germany and Hungary that would be affected directly. For retaliation, I'm not so worried. You mentioned, Andrea, metals and commodities. Yes, there are counter sanctions that Russia could impose. And certainly there are commodities that Russia exports beyond oil and gas that the West really depends on. But I would stress that these are commodities. So, and by definition, there are almost inevitably other sources of them. So I think at the very worst, you would see sort of a short-term market disruption in which prices would rise for something like titanium, which, Boeing and Airbus depend on, or aluminum that Russia exports a lot of. So you see a sort of a short-term spike in prices, but then as sort of markets work, supply and demand, you'd see other producers sort of start producing more to try to take advantage of those high prices, and eventually the market would regain equilibrium. There's no commodity really aside from the gas pipelines to Europe where there's no alternative supplier. So I'm not really all that worried about symmetric retaliation. For asymmetric retaliation, it's really anyone's guess, right? I mean, this is really almost a better question for somebody who deeply understands Russian cyber capabilities. Certainly, American banks have ample warning, and there have been warnings put out that this could happen. But I think if we're talking about a tit-for-tat cycle that really revolves around economic measures, the U.S. really just has complete escalation dominance. Because even if we're talking about imposing full blocking sanctions on Sberbank and export controls, I mean, that is not at all shooting the United States full arsenal at Russia. I mean, we would still have far more sort of arrows in the United States quiver. So I'm not all that concerned about getting in a tit for tat, because it wouldn't be good for Russia if that were to happen.
Tom, you want to jump in? And I don't know if you want to talk at all about kind of the risk management in terms of what we're seeing by businesses in the UK, US, EU.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying Eddie's being blasé, but I think I'm a little bit less blasé, and I suppose I'm a little bit less blasé because I sit in the UK and we talk about like the cost of living crisis. People are worried about supply chains already. I just feel as though this would create systemic issues that we could well do without. And I agree that it may well be the case that these things will work through the system. I'm not sure for how long economies would be prepared to sort of take that kind of pressure. And of course, the pressure, as Eddie rightly points out, will vary enormously between different countries. I mean, I got asked by a journalist over the weekend, well, if there's market turmoil, what will this mean for people's pensions? So I think we start looking at this in that kind of from that sort of granular perspective, then maybe actually the damage, the boomerang effect, I think it's a great way of putting it, is really might be more than we think. That being said, one of the themes of this conversation has been preparation, right? I mean, everyone has been preparing to a greater or less extent, unfortunately, for this moment for some time. So we know that the ECB, for example, has been canvassing the systemic banks within the euro area to make sure that they are on top of their risk exposure to Russia. I'm sure the Bank of England's been doing the same. I've seen some reporting that something that similar has been happening with the American banks. So people absolutely should be getting prepared, but at some point, the reality of this is the integration between Russia and Western economies means that there will need to be a degree of self-harm if we are going to create the sort of pressure on Russia that Western leaders, particularly UK and US leaders, have been promising.
Maria, anything you want to add in terms of kind of how you expect Russia would react, particularly kind of at a higher end of what we're talking about?
Yeah, I think Russia has plenty of options to react, and the benefit of being not necessarily democratic power is that he can use informal sanctions. And it doesn't mean it will be tit for tat and, very clear way, this is what you've done, and we have the same tool to impose pain on you. Cyber attacks obviously have been mentioned. Energy blackmail could be on the table as well. Leveraging these supply chains in terms of critical raw materials. And as I said, for Russia, it might be easier to use it in a very informal way with plausible deniability, saying that wasn't, the government who addressed that. And in this way, it has more room for hitting the Western ways. And I think in Europe, unfortunately, the discussion that is currently dominating the narrative on sanctions is fear of Russia's retaliation. And that very much constrains what the EU is ready to impose. The problem is that, as Tom said, the hard-hitting sanctions will come with this willingness to bear costs. And this is the key part of the credibility. And again, the discussion is very much dominated how to avoid collateral damage, how to avoid unintended consequences. But we are in a point where I'm not sure if even one hard-hitting sanctions option will work. We would need to talk about a package of hard-hitting sanctions. That means a lot of willingness to bear cost, and I'm not sure if Europe is on the same page there.
Wonderful. Yeah, the willingness to bear costs is such an interesting point. There was a great New York Times article over the weekend by Corey Shockey, who talked about how the administration really hadn't yet kind of shaped public attitudes and preparedness to bear costs should we have to do these things and Russia retaliate. So I think that kind of this notion that we're getting to a point where United States and Europe might have to bear some of the costs that are required to push back against Russia is a really important one and probably merits more thinking. But I want to pass the baton to my co-moderator, Emily. But as I do so, one of the things we haven't really delved into is the export control piece of this. And Emily, I know you've done a lot of thinking and work along this. So can you talk a little bit about what you think the administration has in mind? I mean, I think with the sanctions, the way I've heard it articulated, the sanctions on banks and other things are intended to have an immediate kind of hard-hitting upfront effect, whereas these export controls kind of have more impact over time, constricting the defense industrial base and other things. But can you kind of flesh out what we might expect in that part of a response package?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Andrea. It's a good question. So, I mean, I think first it's worth remembering why we're even talking about the technology controls in the first place. These are relatively new when you're thinking about elements of a sanctions package. They weren't included in 2014. And I think that's part of the reason why they're so appealing now is because perhaps Russia hasn't had time to prepare for this particular element. So there is a bit of surprise and additional deterrent impact that these technology controls can have that's worth considering. It's also possible that these technology controls won't have that same sort of negative collateral damage on the US and Europe as some of the sanctions that we've talking about in the energy sector and the financial sector. Clearly, there's going to be impact, but it might not be quite as severe as some of the other sectors that we've been talking about. But what are these controls, right? So there's really two types of controls that we're talking about. One is just the tightening of existing controls on US origin technology. This is a piece of the conversation that I think people forget about because they're so excited to talk about the Huawei style controls. But even just in traditional export controls, there is room to tighten up US technology controls on dual use items, essentially putting Russia into the same category as designated terrorist states. And that'll have an impact. But kind of the second piece of the package, and the one that has been getting a lot of attention, is this idea of the foreign direct product rule, which to date has really only been applied in the Huawei context. And it is pretty interesting because it's a significant extraterritorial application of US export control authority. It's basically saying that even if there is a product that is made entirely out of the United States jurisdiction, entirely outside of the country by a foreign entity, that the US can reach that technology and control it if it's made with US tools and software. And so where this really comes up is in the semiconductor sector. because there the United States has near global dominance in the equipment manufacturing tools and the design software that goes into chips. There is basically no chip that's made in the world today that isn't made with US tools and software. So if you can use this foreign direct product rule to prevent any chip that's made with US tools or software from going to Russia, that is potentially an enormous choke point that the United States has dominance over. And that's why it's being considered. There's obviously a big caveat here, which is that we don't yet know how that foreign direct product rule would be applied. It could be more narrowly tailored to specific entities. It could be tailored to specific sectors. It seems unlikely, from what we've heard from the administration to date, that it would be applied to the entire country as a whole. They've been talking about technology controls for the defense industrial base, so it does seem like there's some sort of targeting. We don't know exactly what that targeting looks like. We do know the administration is getting ready. So the Department of Commerce issued a rule earlier this month that reorganized and clarified the foreign direct product rules to make it a little bit easier bureaucratically to add new entities to essentially the Huawei type control list. So they're ready to do this, and clearly they have some targets in mind. The last thing I'll point out on this before we start diving into some of the other sanctions tools more specifically is that even though this tool is attractive and we have this choke point technology, it will be really complicated, I think, to enforce this once these rules are imposed. And that's because when you look at the semiconductor, assuming that it's semiconductors is where they're going to do this, when you look at the semiconductor value chain, even though we have choke points at certain very important nodes along that value chain, what we don't have is any country or any company that has the entire nuts to bolts, materials to final product control over the value chain. And so here you have to think about China's ability to potentially play a bit of a spoiler role here. Clearly, the administration is worried about that. We understand that came up in some of their conversations with Chinese counterparts. I think it is a real open question about how willing China would be to enforce U.S. extraterritorial export controls for goods that flow through China, which most electronic goods will flow through China. But at the same time, China likely isn't going to want to jeopardize its own supply of these chips. So it gets massively complicated once you actually start to think about how you would enforce this and how you would enforce this over time, particularly if it's on a wider range of chip technologies or products. So really interesting topic there, but not as easy and to apply as one might think. And, you know, I would, if Andrea has to depart now, I would love to get Maria's thoughts on this in terms of kind of how ready Russia is to respond to some of these technology controls, or what their response might be if some of these wide-ranging export controls are actually applied.
Yeah, I agree with Emily's your point about the question that I have, how effective it would be as a deterrent. Obviously, as a tool, it's one of those options that are more asymmetrical. There is less blowback on Europe or the US. So there is readiness even within the EU to impose export controls. There is much less discussion than in the energy sector. So the readiness is there, but I guess where I am not convinced if we impose sanctions on, let's say, artificial intelligence, how will this change Putin's calculus not to invade Ukraine tomorrow? I'm not so sure that this will be a powerful deterrent. Long term, yes, but if we're talking about deterrence over the next week or maybe tomorrow, because 16th of February is supposed to be an important date, then I'm not so sure. So, and here is where I think important to distinguish the export controls that were featured is the critical technology and emerging technology. And here, critical technology is something that will have a faster impact on Russia, and Russia is not necessarily prepared. Semiconductors, chips, something that was already affected by 2014 sanctions partially. And when I analyzed how prepared Russia is now, well, it's not very prepared. This is the semiconductor industry is very much dependent on foreign suppliers from the Netherlands or the US. It tried to diversify to Asian suppliers, for example, at some point Chinese, Indonesian, and Malaysian suppliers were the leading. It might not be the highest quality, but it will be enough for the Russian defense sector to operate. And if we cover the emerging technology, something that is very long-term, Russia did state that it has this ambition to develop it. And here I would say, amongst the all hype talks, how far we are pushing Russia towards China, I think this is the case where we will be pushing Russia towards China, because China does have very big ambition made in China by 2025 to create this indigenous production, of tools and manufacturing, but also of emerging technologies by 2035. So in this case, Chinese have invested and plan to allocate lavish subsidies in this sector, and they could control 70% of this indigenous production. So Russia could rely potentially on China in this sector. So I'm less convinced that this will be a good option for deterrence.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I want to move next to SWIFT, but as we do, I just want to remind the audience as well that they're free to submit questions. We've already gotten a bunch of questions that have come in that we'll start to incorporate into the conversation. But just as a reminder, if you want to submit a question, it's popped up on the box there, cnas.org/live, or you can tweet at us as well, and we'll start working some of those in. But let's move to the SWIFT option, which some observers have described as the nuclear option. But as we know, SWIFT is really about messaging, and so there's a question about if you take the messaging offline, can't the underlying transaction still proceed? And if we're also thinking about doing SDN list designations for some of the major Russian banks, how impactful is the SWIFT option? Why are we considering that in addition to some of the SDN listings of the major banks? So Maria, I know you've done some work on this, so why don't we go to you first, and then Tom would welcome your thoughts on that as well.
It is true, it's been called a nuclear option. And I think the perception of a nuclear option is as important here, because in sanctions areas, perception matters. And if markets perceive it as a nuclear option, we might see overreaction in the short term. And this is, I think, where the nuclear effect will come in. We'll see more capital outflow, more than we saw over the past few weeks, and we'll see currency volatility. Domestically, Russia does have an alternative to SWIFT called SPFS. It controls about 20% of its domestic transactions. But when I analyzed, obviously, what it can do internationally, not so much. It doesn't have a lot of international links to financial institutions. Only Bank of China is linked to this, and a bunch of post-Soviet banks like from Belarus or Kazakhstan. So if Russian banks are cut off, then the question is, how do you pay for oil and gas to Europe? And I think, again, this interdependence will work as a shield. In the short term, it will be quite devastating impact, but the long term comes with this interdependence in the energy market. Will Germany be willing to find a workable solution in this? Probably yes, because it needs Russian gas. And this is where I'm speculating, but potentially Russia could say it will be conditioned on linking it to Russian equivalent. And it might have long-term implications, something that the US Treasury Sanctions Review mentioned, that new payment system, new messaging system might undermine what we have now. It's a very long term, but I think it would be a mistake to just discard it easily in this case.
Tom, did you want to add to that?
Yes. So I think SWIFT, or the SWIFT, has almost become shorthand for targeting the Russian banking system. One of the things I always like to ask people who start talking about SWIFT is, well, tell me, what does SWIFT do? And it's surprising how many, particularly people in the political class, still think that SWIFT is moving money around the world. And of course, as you said, Emily, and as Maria pointed out, this is a messaging system. It's a very efficient messaging system. It has a near monopoly on international payments. It is, in my view, to some extent, and I know it's been targeted before, but to some extent, it is a kind of, it's a critical part of global financial architecture. So maybe it should be the Switzerland of global financial architecture, and should be off limits. So I do think that, personally, I would be very surprised if SWIFT is an early name on the list, because you can cut Russian financial access in other ways. Now, of course, what SWIFT would continue to potentially do is allow Russian banks to communicate with other banks in the world that are not signed up to the Western sanctions focus. So that would be a gap that we would need to think about. But I also think, to Maria's point, look, the financial engineer in me, from my 20 years at JP Morgan, looks at this situation and says, well, there are ways in which one could create bulk payment systems between countries and do all sorts of things to try and continue to make payments flow between countries that want to have a financial connection with Russia and Russian banks. So SWIFT, nuclear option, it's a good headline. I have to say, I wouldn't necessarily expect to see it on the sanctions list anytime soon. I will probably regret saying that, but I'm saying that now.
Yeah, I want to come back to some of the energy sector implications of the sanctions package. We've gotten a few questions from the audience, as well as one about what's happening in Congress, which we haven't talked about yet. But obviously, there have been a lot of concerns in the U.S. Congress about previously Nord Stream 2 and Russia's ability to leverage its energy linkages with Europe. And so, Eddie, I wanted to ask you kind of if you could walk us through what the U.S. and its allies are doing to kind of change and mitigate Russia's kind of leverage in the energy sector, and what do we expect from Congress at this point?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because 50% of Russia's export revenues come from oil and gas. So this is a heavily energy dependent economy. And yet, in my initial remarks, when I talked about the Biden administration signaling about what would be sanctioned, you haven't heard anything really about sanctions on oil and gas, of course, apart from Nord Stream 2. Which, I'll remind everyone, is a pipeline that is not pumping any gas to Europe right now. So this wouldn't affect any sort of gas flows in the immediate term. And I think that's really because the Biden administration is concerned about the possibility of impacting domestic gasoline prices and the domestic economic situation in the United States. Clearly, there are concerns in Europe about gas supplies. From what I can gather, the Europeans don't have the ability to very quickly switch away from Russian gas. So while the Biden administration has done a great job trying to find sort of emergency LNG supplies for the Europeans if Russia were to cut off gas to Europe, this isn't something that could happen without significant disruption. And so in my earlier remarks, when I mentioned that I do think that if Russia invades, we're sort of on almost a treadmill or sort of a glide path to Iran-style sanctions over the next few months. What I'm really saying is I don't think that it's tenable for energy to be off the table long-term if Russia were to invade Ukraine. In 2014, interestingly enough, we did impose sanctions on Russian oil companies. Rosneft is on the SSI list. Novatek is on the SSI list. One of the marquee sanctions in 2014 were significant prohibitions on the exports of goods, services, and technology to Russia's Arctic offshore deepwater and shale oil projects. So I would suspect that at the very least, those sanctions would expand eventually to cover all Russian oil projects. So you'd see sort of a broad exodus of global oil companies out of the Russian oil sector, including existing conventional oil fields. But I do think that it's not untenable for Russian oil sales themselves to also come under sanctions. In the Iran sanctions experience, by far the most impactful sanction, aside from sort of blacklisting of all the major Iranian banks, were sanctions that reduced Iran's oil exports significantly from 2.5 million barrels a day to under 1 million barrels a day in just a few years. Yes, Russia is a bigger oil exporter than Iran ever was. It's about 5 million barrels a day, so twice of what Iran was sort of when sanctions came into force. But again, this is not untenable, and oil is a commodity. And certainly if there's time for the market to adjust, you could see significant decreases in Russian oil exports, which to me would be the biggest sanction on Russia, given that oil itself is 45% of export revenue. So we think of Russia as an oil and gas economy, but really oil is the economic lifeblood of the Kremlin. And I do think it's more vulnerable to sanctions than gas because there are more readily available substitutes.
So let's talk a little bit about what we should expect next over the next 24 hours, the next week. We've talked a little bit about how we think the US and Europe would respond to something short of a full invasion. But And I'll go to you first on this one, Eddie, but would love for Tom and Maria to weigh in as well. What do we expect? Assume that, some gray zone tactics, some cyber. I mean, we're not trying to predict exactly what Putin will do, because even the administration has said that they can't fully predict or doesn't know if he's made a decision on exactly what to do. But, we know that the range of options that we think are practical to anticipate. So gray zone tactics, cyber attacks, and then potentially a full invasion. How do sanctions get rolled out over that course of actions, over that range of actions? What should we expect in the next week to a month? What do we think will be first on the table when it comes to a sanctions package? Are we really looking at all of these options being issued at once and then an intensification, if an invasion happens and is sustained? Welcome your thoughts on that, Eddie, first.
It's a great question. And one thing I'd say is I think the Biden administration has done a really good job of making clear that there are really devastating sanctions ready to go, but they're not going to be imposed unless Russia invades Ukraine. I think that's pretty smart because, you can't have it all. We can't use sanctions to change Russia into, a friendly liberal democracy that acts like Germany or something. That's not going to happen. Sanctions aren't that strong. But I do think if we could use sanctions to deter a Russian military incursion into Ukraine, a major land war that could be the largest war in Europe since the Second World War, I mean, that is a significant accomplishment in and of itself. So I don't suspect the Biden administration to ratchet up sanctions piecemeal, even in the face of significant Russian cyber attacks against Ukraine. It's possible you could see targeted sanctions against specific actors in Russia that would be more symbolic. But in terms of these sanctions against Sberbank or VTB, I really do think from a strategic perspective, it makes good sense to hold back on them until you actually believe that there is going to be a military incursion. I think one of the sort of perversely almost benefits of Biden's gaffe about, small incursion is that it kind of now locked the Biden administration into saying, even if there is any sort of small incursion, as Tom said, I think the UK said a boot into Ukrainian territory, that's what triggers the sanctions package. And I think that's wise because I don't believe that once Putin orders an invasion, once you have all these Russian BTGs streaming into Ukraine, I don't believe that sanctions are going to cause Putin to pull back. I think once that decision is made in the Kremlin, I think that the operation is in play, and Russia is going to really will be decided on the ground between the military situation between Russia and Ukraine. Sanctions aren't going to be the decisive factor. So I do suspect that sanctions will be held out. But in a longer term sense, I think that this does provide a model for how to deter Russia using sanctions in the future, setting clear red lines about invading Ukraine and indicating that very devastating sanctions would come into play. The same type of a red line could be drawn around interference in U.S. elections, for instance. And I think that's something that has been discussed for a long time, including in Congress through the Deter Act, and I think would be wise because even if sanctions are imposed on Sberbank and VTB, there are still a lot the United States could do to ratchet up sanctions against Russia.
Yeah, Tom, would you like to come in on this?
Yeah, I think the narrative in the UK is slightly different because those that have historically been most vocal about Russia and sanctions when it comes to the UK are those who are focused on the dirty Russian money in London, on the oligarchs, as our Foreign Secretary has pointed to. And so there is a lot of pressure within Parliament, again, both sides of the aisle, but also from outside, to actually use this moment to catch up with where the UK should be on dealing with illicit Russian finance in London. So I don't think that will happen, but I think in terms of putting out some markers of what's to come, that is an option, and it's also an option because you have families of these individuals in the UK. They are using the schools, the universities. Their lives are in the UK, and so if you were to start saying, sorry, but the Navalny 35 list, for example, we are going to put those on the sanctions list tomorrow, assuming that the legals hold up, and we're going to revoke your access to the UK and all that sort of stuff. There are some steps like that. Now, some might argue that's quite petty. Many would argue that's way overdue. And so does this give the UK government the opportunity to do things that, frankly, it should have done quite some some time ago. So this kind of delaying situation, maybe that won't be the way it plays out in the UK.
Mm-hmm. Maria, I'd welcome you to come in on this as well, either from broader EU perspectives or, kind of from the Russia perspective. Is this really, is this serving a deterrent effect? I mean, that's kind of the fundamental question here, right? Of, we've got this massive package of sanctions. Is that impacting the calculus at all?
I think it very much depends what's on the table. I don't believe that everything is on the table, even though it's, the main message that has been channeled in media that we're ready to impose everything. But I think the positive here is that gradualism is apparently off. It's, the massive sanctions package will be imposed, and I think it's good in terms of being a better deterrent than just by incrementally increasing pressure on Russia and allowing to adapt to the sanctions pressure. What we can see in the next months, if Russia invades, I fully agree with Eddie that we won't see anything before Russia invades, and that won't be a good deterrence as an instrument. But Russia will definitely use this gray space between escalation, de-escalation, invasion or non-invasion. And again, because of this informality that it's so good at using it, it will use all sorts of tools to impose more costs on Ukraine in this case. But in terms of sanctions package, financial sanctions will probably won't see Sberbank in the first list, but they will be somewhere, saved for the future. But some of the banks that have been floated, VTB, will be in the first round of sanctions. Export controls, as I said, something that doesn't cause a lot of tensions between the allies and within the EU is sort of easier to trigger. Nord Stream 2 is a big question mark. I think will be a lot of political pressure on Germany to allow it to be certified. So I'm not sure how they can get away with it and allow it to be launched. Sovereign debt sanctions, something that can be extended to the secondary market as well. Whether there will be enough, it's a big question. And I think it's not just even the sanctions package itself. I think, again, this unity needs to be there, the time factor, how quickly it can be imposed, and how quickly we can agree on it, because we've still been negotiating since November what it's on the table. And I think it also doesn't send a very good message here. But I want to say the long-term perspective is more important, because the Ukraine crisis is here to stay. Russia will not just back off even with this sanctions package. So the question is, what we will be ready to impose if there is another incursion, if there is another, saber rattling, whatever you can call it. And I think we're running out of those options where there is agreement, to bear the costs as well.
One question from the audience that I'd like to pose before we head into kind of wrap up questions from the Voice of America Russian Service. And maybe we'll kick this one to you, Eddie. Will the U.S. be able to impose effective sanctions against Russian arms exports? To what extent will the countries that buy Russian weapons now maintain these ties with Russia in the event of U.S. sanctions? Do you want to take that, Eddie?
Sure. Yeah. Russian arms exports is really a matter of secondary sanctions, right? Because Russia is exporting arms not to the United States, but really to third countries. So if you remember a few years ago, the whole S-400 issue with Turkey, right? Could the United States shut off those third-party exports? Maria actually mentioned, what does escalation look like beyond this crisis, right? If the U.S. actually does go ahead and sanction Russian banks, what's next? We haven't even talked about these types of secondary sanctions. If we were to try to cut off Russia's oil exports, that would be really threatening secondary sanctions against companies who are buying oil from Russia. It's not sanctions against Russia itself. The same goes for Russian arms exports. If you remember, CATSA, the law that was passed in the summer of 2017 with a veto-proof majority, people mainly remember it for the oligarch list and for really constraining President Trump's ability to lift sanctions. It also did impose, it gave the U.S. government the ability to impose secondary sanctions on foreign entities who are buying Russian arms exports. That tool has been used. There has been efforts to pressure buyers of Russian arms. I suspect, specifically in the wake of this Ukraine crisis, and definitely if Russia does invade, that the United States would really amp up enforcement of that. And I think all it will take is a few really demonstrative actions of the US sanctioning third parties who are buying Russian arms to actually really curb Russian arms exports. Certainly, you won't be able to curb Russian arms exports everywhere. If China wants to buy military kit from Russia, I think it'll be hard to stop that. But I think certainly you could stop it to countries who are more susceptible to U.S. pressure.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and I think we'll wrap up asking each of you to respond to a question that came in from Byron, and it's a good wrap-up question. If the threat of sanctions does not deter Russia, will that matter to future US, UK, or EU policy? Shouldn't these be thought of as economic warfare and not a policy tool to compel or deter? And I might add just a little bit of a twist on that. What is the risk that we end up, imposing, over a series of time, these massive, potentially crippling sanctions that do nothing to deter? And so then we are stuck in a year to 5 years with a heavily sanctioned regime that failed to achieve its political objectives. I mean, that's kind of the key question of sanctions policy today, right? Is whether they can be effectively used to deter or coerce behavior that, an adversary state doesn't see as in its interest. So not an overly optimistic question to end on here, but I do think it's an important one. So Maria, why don't I go to you first, then Tom, and we'll give Eddie the last word.
It's an excellent question about the overuse, misuse of sanctions, and one needs to be more careful about how we use it. But again, depends on what type of sanctions cannot deter. If the most nuclear options cannot deter, then we really need to think about what else do we have here. And I think the other aspects of this obviously is not just sticks but carrots, something that EU has been doing for Ukraine, providing economic help to Ukraine, the country that's been in the crosshairs of, crossfire between Russia actions, but also unintended consequences of just being the hostage in this situation. So economic help to those countries can also alleviate the pressure and may not deter, but at least they can help to sustain the country economically. The second strategy here would be to bolster the West internally. And what I mean here is to increase its autonomy in terms of energy diversification, better infrastructure in terms of shielding itself from cyber attacks. So being stronger from within might also create more potentials for sanctions or being less vulnerable to those actions of those countries.
Tom?
Look, I think you end up with essentially, two or multiple walled gardens with a kind of a Western world that gets used to dealing without access to Russian gas or whatever it might be, and with a Russia, not necessarily Russia-centered, but a kind of a world in that part of the globe that deals with finance to the east and whatever it might be. I mean, it would be an unfortunate situation, but it would be an acceleration in a way of what we're kind of experiencing already. I mean, the thing that actually I would just like to end on is what happens if the Russians do not invade Ukraine? Like what happens next there? Obviously, places like Germany will face the challenge of thinking about, well, what do we do about Nord Stream now? I mean, I'm particularly interested in what the UK government will do, because, as I think I've said already, the UK government has acknowledged that it has a dirty money problem with London, and that money is dirty regardless of whether the Russians invade Ukraine or not. So the question is the UK government going to take that issue seriously? Does it really need Vladimir Putin to press the button and cross the line in order to clean up London's reputation? So I guess, like all of us, I'm hoping that we don't have to use these sanctions regimes for what they are currently being discussed. But I also don't want us to forget the lessons that we've learned over the recent months and ensure that energy independence is central, all these sorts of things. And in the case of the UK, we actually finally get on with dealing with the problem that we have at home.
Eddie, last word.
Thank you. Well, from the beginning, the Biden administration has been explicit that the goal here is to deter a Russian military invasion of Ukraine. And I think we need to be honest with ourselves that if Russia does invade Ukraine, deterrence has failed. That this policy, this project of the Biden administration to use the threat of sanctions to deter has failed. It probably would make sense, or would be understandable if the some analysts would say, oh, well, that's because, sanctions could never deter Russia. But I think there's also an alternative explanation. It could also be a number of other reasons. It could be that Putin misjudged how impactful sanctions would be. And I think that, the sanctions that were imposed in 2014 were relatively modest. Sanctions were not really ratcheted up at all in the last 8 years. And I think there seems to be some overconfidence in Moscow about the ability to weather sanctions. So it could be that there's a misperception problem, in which case the goal then, if Russia does invade, becomes to impose really severe costs, to make Putin pay for this invasion. Because you need to then demonstrate that, hey, look, there are really devastating costs to this type of an invasion. And I think if those costs can be imposed, then potentially the next time that the U.S. tries to use sanctions as a deterrent, the message may be more well received and come across more clearly. In terms of long-term, being worried about, a sanctions regime that's impossible to remove, that's something I'm not particularly worried about, because I think even aside from this current Ukraine crisis, there's very little chance for Russian relations with the West to improve significantly so long as Putin is president. And so I think, certainly if Russia does invade Ukraine, the policy of the West has to be then to weaken Russia's capacity to do more harm. And to that end, I think sanctions will be a very significant and central part of Western policy, at least as long as Putin is president of Russia.
Sobering words. Well, Eddie, Maria, Tom, thank you so much for being with us today. Thank you to everyone in the US and in Europe who tuned in for this. I will just note that CNAS has produced 2 reports on sanctions in Russia that's available on our website. And Andrea's Transatlantic Security Program has another report coming out later this week. So stay tuned for that. Thank you all for joining us. Thanks to the CNAS comms team for running this show, and be well, everyone.